Benito Mussolini built a fascist empire and marched the country into one of the deadliest wars in history. But by the spring of 1945, everything had changed. His empire was crumbling, his allies defeated, and Mussolini himself was running for his life. In just a few days, his world would end in a brutal way. What happened in those final moments shaped Italy's future forever. Just a few years earlier, Mussolini had controlled all of Italy with an iron grip. Now his fascist republic in the north, set up in 1943 with help from Nazi Germany, was falling apart fast. The Allies were moving up from the south, and Italian partisans were taking back control of towns and cities across the north. Mussolini had lost not only his power, but also the support of his own people. Many Italians now blamed him for years of war, destruction, and humiliation. Mussolini was 61 years old. His health had declined, and he looked much older than before. His voice had lost the energy it once had. His face was pale and tired. On April 25, 1945, Mussolini was in Milan. He met with a few remaining supporters and military officers. Some urged him to make a final stand and fight, but Mussolini knew the situation was hopeless. German troops were retreating, and Adolf Hitler was trapped in his Berlin bunker. Mussolini understood that the end had come. He refused to surrender to the partisans because he feared torture or a public trial. He also didn't want to fall into Allied hands where he might be used as a political tool. So he made a last-minute decision to escape. He hoped to reach Switzerland, which had remained neutral during the war. There he believed he could negotiate asylum or even find a route to Franco's Spain, which was still under a friendly fascist regime. He didn't want to live the rest of his life in exile, but at this point, survival was the only goal. He left Milan in a convoy of cars with his longtime lover Carlo Petacci and a small group of loyal fascists. Among them were ministers, soldiers, and officials who had stayed by his side despite the collapse of the regime. Clara refused to leave Mussolini, even when she had the chance to escape separately. She wanted to be with him no matter what happened. The roads were full of danger. Partisan roadblocks had been set up everywhere in northern Italy. Towns like Como, Lecco, Dongo were already under partisan control or being surrounded. German soldiers, who had once guarded the area, were retreating in large numbers. Mussolini decided to travel with the retreating German convoy, hoping he could hide among them. The convoy was made up of trucks and vehicles carrying soldiers from the German 52nd Anti-Aircraft Division. These troops were trying to flee Italy and reach Germany through Switzerland or Austria. Mussolini believed that hiding among them was his only real chance to get out alive. It was a long shot, but he had no better option. To avoid being recognized, Mussolini put on a German Luftwaffe greatcoat and steel helmet. His fascist uniform, which once showed off his rank and pride, was now hidden under military gear that didn't belong to him. He climbed into the back of a truck with other German soldiers, kept his head down, and remained silent. He even carried fake documents that identified him as a low-ranking German soldier. Clara Petacci, who refused to leave his side, was also in the convoy, riding in another vehicle. Several high-ranking fascists, including ministers and bodyguards, were traveling with them too, hoping they could escape together. But they were all headed into a region full of danger. Lake Como and the surrounding villages were now under the watch of partisan fighters who were stopping every suspicious vehicle. On the morning of April 27th, the convoy reached the small lakeside village of Dongo, not far from the Swiss border. A group of armed Italian partisans had set up a checkpoint at the entrance to the town. They were led by Pierluigi Bellini della Stella and Urbano Lazzaro, two young resistance leaders in their 20s. Their mission was to stop escaping fascists, capture them, and make sure they never got away. As the trucks rolled into the village, the partisans stopped each one and began checking the passengers. They ordered the soldiers to get out of the vehicles one by one. The Germans, knowing the war was over for them, mostly cooperated. But then they noticed one soldier didn't quite fit in. The man looked older than the others. He was quiet, tense, and clearly uncomfortable. When asked to speak, he said nothing. He didn't speak German, and his Italian accent was impossible to hide. One of the partisans, Bellini della Stella, became suspicious. The man's face looked familiar. He stared at him, trying to make the connection. Finally, after checking the documents and taking a closer look at his face, they realized who he was. The soldier in disguise was Benito Mussolini. There was no fight. He didn't resist. He was pale, silent, and completely defeated. The partisans immediately arrested him. Clara Petacci was also captured, along with several other high-ranking fascists. They were taken into custody on the spot in Dongo. The partisans knew they had made a major breakthrough. This wasn't just another fascist officer. To many Italians, he was the reason for years of violence, bombings, hunger, and loss. The partisans didn't want to keep him in Dongo for too long. They feared that word of his capture might spread, and if that happened, loyal fascist forces or even some German units might still try to free him. Though the German army was collapsing, there were still dangerous elements in northern Italy. They decided to move quickly and quietly. Mussolini, along with Clara Petacci, was taken under guard to a small house in the nearby town of Mezzegra. It was a quiet, remote place on the western shore of Lake Como. The house belonged to the De Maria family, and it was being used as a temporary holding spot for the prisoners. Armed partisans stood outside, keeping watch day and night. Inside, Mussolini and Clara were kept separated from the others and were given basic food and water. The leaders of the resistance movement met to decide what to do next. The National Liberation Committee for Northern Italy was based in Milan. It was made up of representatives from different anti-fascist political groups, communists, socialists, Catholics, and Democrats, who had joined forces to fight Mussolini's regime and end the war. Some members of the resistance believed that Mussolini should be given a public trial. They thought it was important to let the world see him answer for his actions. The invasion of Ethiopia, the alliance with Hitler, the racial laws against Jews, and the many Italians imprisoned, tortured, or killed under his rule. A trial would also show that Italy was now moving toward democracy and justice. But others disagreed. They feared that a trial would take too long. There were still German troops nearby, and fascist supporters were scattered across the region. If word of Mussolini's location got out, there was a real chance that someone would try to rescue him. The partisans didn't want to take that risk. They had been fighting and dying for years. There was also another reason. The war was ending, and the Allies were arriving fast. If Mussolini were handed over to the Allies, he might get special treatment. He might claim he was just following Hitler's orders. He might even use the trial to spread fascist ideas again. Partisans didn't want to take that chance. By the morning of April 28, 1945, the decision had already been made at the highest level of the Italian resistance. Benito Mussolini was not going to face a courtroom or be handed over to the Allies. He was going to be executed, quietly, quickly, and without delay. The man chosen to carry out the mission was Walter Aldisio, a member of the Italian Communist Party and a respected partisan fighter. At that time, he was known only by his false name, Colonel Valerio. This secret identity helped keep his role hidden, both from enemy forces and from anyone who might try to stop the plan. Aldisio had been active in the resistance for years and was trusted by the National Liberation Committee. He was not working alone. With him were Albo Lampredi and Michel Moretti, two other experienced partisans who were familiar with the area and the risks. Together, the small group made their way toward the small town of Giulino di Mezzegra, a quiet village just south of where Mussolini and Clara Petacci were being held. Their mission was to execute Mussolini and Clara, and it had to be done in a way that wouldn't create chaos or allow anyone to interfere. Aldisio was handed a pistol and a submachine gun. He also carried the written orders from the CLNAI authorizing the execution. The plan had to be carried out away from the public eye to avoid any unrest in the local towns or resistance from remaining fascist sympathizers. The partisans didn't want a crowd, a protest, or worse, a fight. At that time, Mussolini and Clara still didn't know what was coming. They were being held under guard. The windows were shut, and few people were allowed near them. Mussolini stayed mostly silent. He didn't shout, argue, or try to escape. He ate very little and barely spoke. Witnesses later described him as looking pale, tired, and old. His posture was weak and his expression was empty. The fear, the exhaustion, and the shame had taken over. Clara stayed close to him. She had refused to leave his side, even when she was told it would be safer. Though she had never held an official political role, she was known to be fiercely loyal to Mussolini. She had grown up in a wealthy Roman family, and her father had once been the Pope's doctor. Clara had loved Mussolini for years, and in the end, she chose to die with him, rather than abandon him. Back outside, Aldicio and his men carefully prepared. They had picked a quiet wall near the Villa Belmonte, a small building on a country road in Giulini di Mezzegra. It was a lonely spot near an iron gate and some trees, far enough from town to keep things quiet, but close enough for a fast exit once the job was done. By the afternoon of April 28, 1945, Mussolini and Clara were told they were going to be moved to another location. The partisans didn't mention the real reason. They just said it was a transfer, and the two followed without resistance. A black Alfa Romeo 6C was brought for the task. It was a sleek, quiet vehicle that wouldn't draw too much attention. Driving the car were Walter Aldicio and Aldo Lampredi. Both men were armed and focused. Mussolini climbed into the car quietly. Clara followed close behind him. There was no screaming, no running, no attempt to escape. Both seemed to know that something was not right, but neither fought it. The car started rolling through the narrow roads of Mezzegra. The ride was short, maybe 15 minutes, but it was heavy with silence. They arrived at a peaceful spot in front of Villa Belmonte. When they arrived, Mussolini was asked to get out of the car and stand near the stone wall. Clara Petacci also stepped out. She was told she didn't have to be there. The partisans offered her a chance to leave, to save herself, but Clara refused to go. She had made her choice. Clara held on tightly to Mussolini's arm. She stood close to him, refusing to let go. She begged to die with him. They had not originally planned to kill her, but after her insistence, they decided not to separate them. At around 4:10 p.m. on that day, Mussolini and Clara were ordered to stand with their backs to the stone wall just outside Villa Belmonte. There were no crowds, no reporters, just a handful of armed partisans and two people about to die. Mussolini didn't resist. He walked slowly to the wall and stood still. He didn't say anything. He didn't beg or argue. Clara was crying. Her loyalty in those final seconds was clear to everyone watching. Walter Aldicio stepped forward with his weapon. He pulled out a French-made MAS 38 machine gun. He had used it during partisan operations before, but this time when he pulled the trigger, nothing happened. The gun jammed. There was a moment of confusion. Aldicio was frustrated, but didn't hesitate. He reached for another weapon, a Beretta pistol, more reliable and ready to fire. Without any formal words, without warning, he raised the pistol and pulled the trigger. Mussolini was hit directly in the chest. The bullet tore through him, and he collapsed immediately. He didn't scream, and died right there against the wall. Clara, still clinging to his side, was shot moments later. She was gunned down and fell beside him, her body landing just inches away from his. Both of them died instantly. There was no last speech, no final message to the world, just the sound of gunfire echoing across the quiet streets of Giulino di Mezzegra. The partisans didn't celebrate. They knew what they had done and why, but it wasn't a moment of happiness. It was the end of a dark chapter. During all of this, something else was happening back in Dongo. The partisans weren't only after Mussolini. They also had more than a dozen top fascist officials in their hands. These were men who had stood by Mussolini until the very end. Now they were facing the consequences. On that same day, on April 28th, 15 high-ranking fascists who had been captured from the German convoy were lined up and shot in the main square of Dongo. Among those executed was Alessandro Pavolini, the leader of the Black Shirts, Italy's fascist paramilitary forces. He had helped organize violence against anti-fascists, Jews, and political enemies for years. Even after Mussolini lost power in 1943, Pavolini stayed loyal and played a key role in the puppet Italian Socialist Republic set up by the Nazis in northern Italy. He was a powerful symbol of the fascist hardliners. Another well-known name was Achille Starace, one of Mussolini's oldest allies. Starace had been a major propaganda figure and once led the National Fascist Party. By the time of his capture, he was no longer important politically, but he was still seen as a symbol of the old regime. He had spent years helping Mussolini spread fascist ideas and tighten control over Italy. The executions weren't done in secret. Many local villagers came out to watch. Italy had suffered under fascism for over 2 decades, and people were angry. Some villagers even shouted at the fascists as they were led to their deaths. After they were shot, the bodies were left on display for a while. A few were later thrown into Lake Como, their corpses sinking into the deep water. By the evening of April 28th, the Italian Social Republic was finished. Its leaders were dead, its army was broken, and its dictator lay lifeless beside a stone wall, just a few miles away. The bodies of Mussolini and Clara were first moved to a nearby town for temporary holding. Early the next morning on April 29th, partisans placed the bodies in the back of a military truck and began to drive to Milan, Italy's industrial heart, and the birthplace of Mussolini's political movement. This wasn't just any city. Milan was where Mussolini had first gathered support after World War I. In 1919, he launched the Fasci di Combattimento, the group that eventually became the National Fascist Party. By 1922, he had used this movement to march on Rome and seize control of the Italian government. But Milan was also a city that had suffered under fascist rule. Resistance groups had been active there, and the population had faced brutal repression. One event stood out that occurred on August 10, 1944, when German forces and fascist police executed 15 Italian partisans at Piazzale Loreto, a major public square in the city. Their bodies were dumped there as a warning to others who might resist. This act of cruelty burned into the city's memory. So when the partisans brought Mussolini's corpse to Milan, they chose Piazzale Loreto on purpose. It was revenge, both symbolic and direct. When the truck arrived and unloaded the bodies of Mussolini, Clara, and several top fascists, people in the city quickly heard the news. Within hours, a large, angry crowd gathered in the square. Many had lost family members in the war, suffered under fascist laws, or lived in fear during Mussolini's dictatorship. People shouted at the bodies. Some spat on them, others kicked them or threw stones. Women screamed, men cursed. It was an explosion of rage that had been building for years. To make a final statement, the partisans hoisted Mussolini, Clara Petacci, and a few of the executed fascists upside down from the roof of a gas station in the same square. It was a small, steel-framed Esso gas station at the edge of Piazzale Loreto. The bodies were tied by their ankles and left hanging, swinging slightly above the crowd. This was not just to humiliate Mussolini. It was also a grim reference to how his regime had displayed the bodies of resistance fighters in public, like trophies or warnings. Now he was the one on display. Clara's body was hung beside his, along with Alessandro Pavolini and others from the Dongo executions. Blood dripped onto the pavement below. Some members of the crowd threw more objects at the bodies. A few even shot at them. Photos were taken from every angle. Journalists, partisans, and regular citizens all captured the moment. These images were soon printed in newspapers across Italy, and then around the world. After the public display, the bodies were taken to the Institute of Legal Medicine at the University of Milan for an official autopsy. The goal was to document the cause of death, confirm the identity, and create a formal medical record. The examination was led by Dr. Mario Marchesi, a respected pathologist. On April 30th, 1945, he carefully examined Mussolini's remains. His report confirmed that Mussolini had been executed by gunfire. Marchesi counted 9 bullet wounds on Mussolini's body. A fatal shot had entered the chest and exited through the back, destroying vital organs. Some of the other shots struck his abdomen, neck, and legs, likely fired after he had already collapsed. Clara's body was also examined. She had been hit by several bullets as well, mostly in the lower body and chest. The wounds on both showed they had been fired upon at close range, consistent with a summary execution rather than a shootout or struggle. After the autopsy, Italian authorities faced a serious problem. They feared that any grave, marked or unmarked, could become a symbolic site for fascist loyalists. Even in defeat, Mussolini still had followers. If his burial site became known, it could turn into a place of pilgrimage or even a rallying point for future fascist movement. To prevent this, officials decided to bury his body in secret. On May 1st, 1945, under heavy guard, Mussolini's corpse was placed in a plain wooden coffin and quietly buried in the Musoccio Cemetery, a large municipal graveyard in Milan. The grave had no headstone, no name, and no markers of any kind. It was simply one among thousands of anonymous plots. Only a small number of people knew the exact location. Even most government workers and police officers were kept in the dark. Clara was later buried in a family tomb in Rome. But the story didn't end there. Almost a year later, on April 23, 1946, a group of fascist loyalists broke into the cemetery and stole the remains. The man who led this bold act was Domenico Laccisi, a young fascist sympathizer and journalist. Laccisi and his group wanted to protect Mussolini's body from being forgotten and turned into a symbol for the fascist cause, which still had some supporters despite the regime's collapse. After stealing the coffin, they hid Mussolini's body in various secret locations to avoid the police. For over 4 months, the body moved from house to house and even ended up in remote countryside spots. This created a tense manhunt as the Italian police and government searched for the stolen remains. Finally, in August 1946, the authorities discovered Mussolini's body hidden in a monastery near Milan. The monastery belonged to the Franciscan friars, who had no idea the body was concealed there until the police came. Once recovered, the government took back custody of the remains. However, even after the recovery, the government was still very cautious. They feared that publicly displaying or burying Mussolini's body in a known place could ignite unrest or give rise to fascist movements again. For more than a decade, his remains stayed in secure government custody, with strict secrecy around where exactly he was kept. It wasn't until 1957, 12 years after Mussolini's death, that his body was finally returned to his family. The Italian government allowed the remains to be buried in Mussolini's hometown of Predappio, a small town in the Emilia-Romagna region. The burial took place in the San Cassiano Cemetery on April 16, 1957. Mussolini's tomb was built like a small chapel, simple but solid. The tomb is located close to the family home where Mussolini was born in 1883. Over the years, the tomb became a place of pilgrimage for both ordinary visitors curious about history and for fascist supporters who continued to admire Mussolini. It remains a place of controversy in Italy. Every year, some people bring flowers or fascist symbols, while others come to protest or remember the victims of fascism. The town of Predappio, because of Mussolini's grave, has become closely linked to his legacy, drawing thousands of visitors who want to see the final resting place of Italy's most infamous dictator.